In the spring of 2021, a woman named Teresa Dada was walking her dog along a drainage canal near her home in a subdivision outside of Houma, Louisiana, when she saw something moving in the tall grass on the opposite bank. She described it later to a local wildlife officer as a large, dark animal, low to the ground, moving with a deliberate, unhurried quality that stopped her in place. She said it was not moving like a coyote. She had seen coyotes. She said it was heavier than that and longer, and it moved without the nervous, head-swiveling quality of an animal that expects to be chased. It moved like an animal that has not spent significant time worrying about being seen. She watched it for approximately 15 seconds before it disappeared into the grass. She told the officer she thought it was a large dog. The officer asked her to describe the shape of its head and the length of its tail and the way it carried itself when it walked. She answered each question carefully. The officer did not tell her what he suspected. He thanked her and drove to the site and found prints in the mud along the bank and photographed them and sent the photographs to Baton Rouge. The response he received confirmed what he had suspected from the description. The prints were consistent with a large male black bear. Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries officially classified Louisiana as a state with no wild bear population. That classification was, by that morning in Houma, not accurate, and everyone in the department who received those photographs understood that. That incident is not isolated. It is not anomalous. It is not a one-time navigation error by a confused individual animal that wandered across a state line and would eventually wander back. It is one data point in a pattern that has been accumulating across the eastern and midwestern United States for approximately 15 years, and that has accelerated sharply in the last 5. Black bears are appearing in places where black bears are not supposed to be. Not in the marginal zones at the edges of their documented range, where the occasional dispersing individual has always pushed the boundary of what maps say is possible. They are appearing in states that not only lack a breeding population, but that officially concluded, decades ago, that the ecological and political conditions for bear recolonization did not exist. They are appearing in subdivisions and strip mall parking lots and schoolyard tree lines in counties that have not produced a confirmed bear sighting in living memory. They are being photographed by trail cameras set for deer in bottomland forests, where the most recent professional biological assessment concluded that bear habitat quality was insufficient to support the species. And wildlife agencies in those states are, with increasing frequency, responding to those photographs in a way that reveals the tension at the center of this story. They are confirming the animals are bears, providing guidance about how residents should respond to bear encounters, and declining to say anything specific about what the presence of those bears means for the official classification of the state as bear-free. If you have found this, and you are the kind of person who notices the gap between what official records say and what is actually happening in the field, subscribe before we go further. This story has layers, and the layers matter. The official story about black bear range in the eastern United States is a story about loss, followed by partial recovery in specific places. The original range of the American black bear covered essentially the entire continent, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, from Mexico to Alaska. It was among the most broadly distributed large mammals in North American history. By the early 20th century, that range had been compressed dramatically. Hunting pressure, which was intensive and largely unregulated for 2 centuries, combined with the near-total conversion of forested land to agriculture across the eastern half of the continent, produced a collapse in black bear populations that was severe by any measure. In much of the Midwest, the Deep South, outside of specific refugia, and the mid-Atlantic states outside of mountain corridors, bear populations were not simply reduced, they were functionally eliminated. The animals died faster than they reproduced. The habitat that sustained them was removed faster than it could recover, and by the mid-20th century, the range maps that wildlife agencies were drawing showed the black bear confined to a set of specific strongholds. The Appalachian Mountains, from Georgia to Pennsylvania, the Upper Great Lakes region, the Ozark and Ouachita Mountains, the coastal swamps of Florida and the Carolinas, the northern forests of Maine, and the upper Midwest. Outside these areas, the maps showed blank space. The classification was not careless. It reflected the genuine reality of what professional biologists were finding when they surveyed those landscapes. The bears were gone. The recovery that followed was not planned as a landscape-scale phenomenon. It was the cumulative result of a set of policy and ecological changes that individually had modest ambitions, but together produced an effect that has outpaced the projections of the biologists who were tracking it. Regulated hunting replaced unregulated killing in every state with a surviving bear population. Federal and state land protection expanded the base of forested habitat available to bears in the core strongholds. Agricultural abandonment across large portions of the Appalachian uplands, the Ozark Plateau, and the Great Lakes cutover region allowed secondary forest to re-establish on land that had been cleared for farming. White-tailed deer populations, which are the single most important prey species for black bears after mast crops and soft fruits in the diet hierarchy, increased dramatically following the collapse of market hunting and the expansion of forest edge habitat. Garbage management practices that had previously produced a standing supply of easily accessible human food for bears in many areas were reformed partially, though not completely, in ways that reduced the most obvious human food subsidies. The bears in the strongholds increased. They increased substantially. And then they did what large mammals with expanding populations and sufficient habitat connectivity do. They moved. The dispersal pattern that has been documented over the past 3 decades represents one of the most significant and least publicly discussed wildlife recolonization events in American history. In Virginia, bear populations that were confined to the Blue Ridge and Allegheny mountain systems in the 1970s have expanded through the Piedmont and into the coastal plain in a progression that state wildlife officials have tracked through harvest data, vehicle collision records, and verified sighting reports. In Kentucky, the bear population in the eastern mountains has moved steadily westward, crossing the Kentucky River and establishing breeding activity in counties that had not reported confirmed bears for a century. In Arkansas, the population reintroduced to the Ouachita and Ozark National Forests in the 1950s and 1960s, using transplanted animals from Minnesota, has grown from a few hundred individuals to an estimated population in the low thousands, and is now producing dispersers that are moving into Oklahoma, Missouri, and Louisiana at a rate that has forced those states to update their management frameworks. In Mississippi, bears that spent 2 decades being classified as occasional transients from Arkansas are now producing reproduction in the bottomland hardwood forests of the Delta region and the Pearl River drainage in numbers that suggest a founding population rather than a dispersal phenomenon. Each of these state-level stories has its own specific history and its own specific political and bureaucratic dimensions, but they share a common structure. The bears arrive before the official framework acknowledges them. They are present in the landscape for months or years as a matter of field reality before they are acknowledged as present in the administrative record. The gap between those 2 moments is not random. It reflects the institutional difficulty of updating a classification that has practical management implications, funding consequences, and public communication challenges attached to it. Saying that bears are back requires saying something about what that means for hunting seasons, for livestock compensation programs, for liability exposure when bears cause property damage, and for the public relations work of managing a human population that was told and came to believe that bears were a historical artifact in their state. The update is not simply a biological statement. It is an administrative and political action with cascading consequences. The institutional momentum toward not making it until absolutely necessary is real, understandable, and consequential. The states where this tension has become most acute in recent years are not the states where the recovery was expected. Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, and Pennsylvania have all managed growing bear populations for years and have the infrastructure, the legal frameworks, and the public education programs to handle continued expansion. The states where the tension is most acute are the ones that skip the gradual build phase entirely. The ones where bears are not creeping in from an adjacent established population along a predictable range front, but are instead appearing in core suburban and agricultural areas well ahead of any formal range expansion acknowledgement. Louisiana, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan's Lower Peninsula, Illinois, Missouri's urban counties, Kansas. These are places where the official status is ambiguous at best, where the administrative machinery for managing bears does not exist in its full form, and where the bears are nonetheless present and, in some cases, reproducing. Indiana is instructive because the documentation there has been more systematic than in some other states, and because the trajectory of the official response has been more transparent than is typical. Indiana Department of Natural Resources confirmed in 2019 that it had received and verified a substantially increased number of black bear reports over the preceding 3 years. The confirmed reports came from 17 counties, distributed across the northern, central, and southern portions of the state. No breeding population was confirmed. The DNR's public position was that the animals represented dispersing individuals from established populations in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Kentucky, moving through Indiana territory without establishing residence. That position was scientifically defensible, given the data available in 2019. By 2022, confirmed reports had reached 31 counties. A bear photographed by a trail camera in Johnson County, just south of Indianapolis, was subsequently identified from its physical characteristics as likely a female, a detail that wildlife officers were careful not to emphasize in public communications. A lone dispersing male is a transient. A female in the landscape is a potential founding event. The distinction is biologically enormous and publicly significant, and the management of that distinction in official communications is one of the most revealing aspects of the ongoing institutional response. Ohio's experience parallels Indiana's, but with the additional complication that Ohio's established bear populations to its east and south, primarily in West Virginia and Kentucky, have been growing rapidly enough that the rate of dispersal into Ohio has increased with them. The Ohio Division of Wildlife confirmed 47 black bear reports in 2023, a figure that represented a threefold increase over the confirmed total from 5 years earlier. The geographic spread of those reports extended to counties along Lake Erie in the north, the Columbus metropolitan area in the center, and the agricultural plains of the northwest. An animal photographed in Medina County, which sits in the suburban ring south of Cleveland, had apparently moved through or around the greater Akron metropolitan area to reach the drainage corridor where it was found. That kind of movement, through developed and suburban terrain, in a state with no resident bear population, requires an animal that is not simply a displaced wilderness refugee. It requires an animal that is behaviorally flexible, nutritionally opportunistic, and capable of navigating human-dominated landscapes with a degree of comfort that the public imagination of black bears as deep forest specialists does not accommodate. The behavioral flexibility of the American black bear is, in fact, the central fact of this entire story, and it is the one that wildlife agencies in the states with newly appearing bears have been most reluctant to place in the foreground of their public communications. Black bears are generalists. They are among the most broadly adaptable large mammals in North America. Their diet is approximately 85% plant material across the range, with a composition that shifts opportunistically depending on what is available. They eat acorns, berries, insects, carrion, agricultural crops, human garbage, pet food, birdseed, and livestock, in proportions that reflect what the local environment offers, rather than a fixed dietary preference. They are not specialist predators, bound to specific habitat types in the way that grizzly bears, which require access to specific concentrated food sources like salmon runs or whitebark pine seeds, are bound to them. A black bear can live in a bottomland hardwood forest, a suburban greenway, an agricultural landscape with woodlot fragments, or a boreal forest, provided that the landscape offers adequate food, some cover for denning, and a tolerable level of human disturbance. The tolerable level of human disturbance that black bears can accommodate is, critically, substantially higher than the standard model of bear behavior that shaped public understanding through most of the 20th century. This behavioral flexibility is partly innate and partly learned. Bears that grow up in landscapes with high human activity learn through direct experience that humans do not represent a consistent threat. The learning process is straightforward and rapid by the standards of large mammal behavior modification. A bear that approaches a residential area and finds a standing supply of food in the form of unsecured garbage or birdseed and is not chased, not harassed, not subjected to any negative consequence, has learned something specific and durable about that environment. It has learned that the risk-benefit calculation of proximity to humans is favorable. It will return. It will bring that learned tolerance into its subsequent behavior in a way that shapes how it responds to humans generally. And critically, if it is a female, it will raise cubs in that behavioral context, producing offspring whose baseline tolerance for human proximity is calibrated from birth to a level that is substantially higher than the tolerance exhibited by bears that learned in wild-conditioned landscapes. The process of behavioral habituation to humans in black bears operates on roughly a generational timescale and produces, within 1 to 2 bear generations, a population subset whose behavioral profile is categorically different from the profile of their wild-conditioned counterparts in ways that have profound implications for how wildlife managers can manage them. The garbage dimension of this picture deserves extended treatment because it is simultaneously the most practically important and the most politically fraught element of the human-bear interface in the states where bears are newly appearing. The association between unsecured human food waste and black bear behavior modification is one of the most thoroughly documented relationships in wildlife science. It has been studied intensively in the established bear states for decades, and the findings are consistent across every jurisdiction. Bears that access human food sources learn to seek them preferentially. They associate the food with the spatial and olfactory cues of human habitation. They return to those sources repeatedly. They become progressively more comfortable with the human presence that accompanies the food. They become progressively less responsive to the deterrence measures that humans apply to discourage their presence. The endpoint of this process, if it proceeds without intervention, is a bear that has lost its functional wariness of humans to a degree that creates genuine safety risk and that is almost certainly headed toward lethal removal by wildlife managers. The phrase that wildlife managers use, the phrase that has become something close to axiomatic in bear management, is that a fed bear is a dead bear. The phrase is accurate. The pathway from the first garbage access to lethal removal is not inevitable, but it is well mapped, and the probability of traveling the full distance of it increases with each uneventful food reward the bear receives. In states with established bear populations and mature management frameworks, the mechanisms for addressing this process exist and are deployed with varying effectiveness. Bear-resistant garbage containers are required in many high-density bear areas. Public education campaigns about bird seed, compost, and pet food have reached large portions of the recreation and residential community in bear country. Hazing programs, which involve trained personnel using non-lethal deterrents to re-establish wariness in habituated bears, operate in several states. None of these mechanisms is fully effective. All of them are more effective than nothing. In the states where bears are newly appearing, none of these mechanisms is in place at the scale required. There is no bear-resistant garbage ordinance in the Indianapolis suburbs. There is no hazing program operating in the southern Ohio counties, where bears are now confirmed. There is no public education infrastructure delivering bear coexistence guidance to the residents of the Louisiana parishes, where trail cameras are recording bear activity. The bears are arriving in landscapes where the human population has no framework for them, no behavioral expectations, and no institutional support for developing the habits that reduce the probability of the habituation process running to its damaging conclusion. The consequence of that gap is predictable and is already being documented in incident records that are not widely publicized. In states where bears have been appearing ahead of any official range expansion acknowledgement, the first human-bear incidents that wildlife officers are responding to have a specific character. They involve food conditioning. A bear that has been accessing birdseed or garbage or a compost pile for an extended period without interference is the typical subject of the first incident report that rises to the level of formal management attention. By the time the incident reaches that level, the animal has generally been food conditioning for weeks or months. Its behavioral modification is substantial. It is no longer exhibiting the avoidance of humans that its wild conditioned counterparts would show. It is approaching vehicles, approaching porches, refusing to move away from occupied areas when humans are present. The management response at that stage, in the absence of hazing infrastructure and with limited staff time, is frequently lethal removal. A bear that might have been managed through early intervention in a mature bear state management framework is instead a dead bear that provided the occasion for the first public conversation in that county about the fact that bears are present. The sequence represents the worst possible outcome from a conservation standpoint, and it is playing out repeatedly in the states where official acknowledgement has lagged behind field reality. The political dimensions of bear recolonization in states that have not had bears in living memory are substantial and are generating conflicts that wildlife agencies were not fully prepared for. The reappearance of a large omnivore in agricultural landscapes produces immediate and concrete economic concerns for producers whose operations are exposed to bear depredation. Beehive damage is documented and significant in every state with an expanding bear population. Corn and sorghum depredation is documented in states where bears are new to the agricultural matrix. Livestock losses, primarily poultry and small livestock, are reported. The agricultural community in states like Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri has a political voice in wildlife management that is disproportionate to its population size, a consequence of both the rural weighting of state legislative districts and the historical primacy of agricultural interests in state-level natural resources policy. That political voice is, with increasing consistency, being directed against any official acknowledgement of bear presence that might trigger the regulatory and compensation machinery that acknowledgement would require. A state that officially has no bears has no obligation to provide livestock compensation programs. It has no obligation to manage bear populations, fund hazing programs, or impose bear-resistant container requirements on municipalities. The institutional inertia toward non-acknowledgement has an economic and political dimension that reinforces the bureaucratic inertia discussed earlier. Not acknowledging the bears is, in the short term, cheaper and politically simpler than acknowledging them. The trapping and hunting community has a different but equally complex relationship with bear recolonization. In states where black bears are returning, a segment of the hunting community views their presence with enthusiasm, as the return of a species whose pursuit has historical and cultural resonance in many parts of the South and Midwest, where bear hunting traditions were eliminated along with the bears themselves. A smaller but vocal segment views the bears as a threat to deer populations and to the character of the hunting experience they have known for decades. Wildlife agencies managing the return of bears to states with established deer hunting cultures have navigated this tension in different ways, and the outcomes have varied accordingly. Where the hunting community has been engaged early and constructively in the management process, as it was in parts of the Appalachian expansion states, the result has been a coalition that supports regulated hunting as a management tool, advocates for habitat protection, and provides a ground-level monitoring network through trail cameras and incidental encounters. Where the hunting community has been treated as an afterthought in the management discussion, as it has been in some of the more recently colonized states, the result has been a fragmented response that has not contributed effectively to either the monitoring or the management of the arriving population. The livestock compensation question is worth examining in the detail it deserves, because it represents the most concrete and immediate policy challenge that bear recolonization creates in states with no management infrastructure. Every established bear state in the eastern United States maintains some form of livestock depredation compensation program, funded through various combinations of hunting license revenue, federal wildlife assistance funds, and general appropriations. These programs exist because the political coalition that supports bear conservation in agricultural states is built, in part, on the understanding that the costs of living with bears are not borne entirely by individual producers. The producer who loses a beehive to a bear receives compensation. The producer who loses a batch of poultry receives compensation. The compensation is rarely full market value, and the administrative burden of documentation is real, but the program signals that the state has accepted some shared responsibility for the consequences of its bear management decisions. In states where bears are arriving without official acknowledgement, there is no such program, and there is no political pathway to creating one without first acknowledging that bears are present in numbers sufficient to require it. The producer who loses beehives in a county where bears officially do not exist has no recourse. That producer is bearing the full cost of a population-level conservation outcome with no institutional support, and the political resentment that generates is entirely understandable and is beginning to express itself in the management discussions of multiple states in ways that will shape the trajectory of recolonization for years. The public safety dimension of bear recolonization in states with no management infrastructure has not yet produced the kind of dramatic incident that would force the issue into wider public awareness. That is partly a function of probability. Black bears injure far more people annually than mountain lions do, but they kill far fewer, and the absolute numbers in both categories remain low relative to the bear population size. The majority of injuries produced by black bears in North America are associated with the same set of conditions that characterize the elevated risk scenario in mountain lion encounters. Habituated animals in close proximity to humans, in low-light conditions, often involving food resources, frequently involving surprise at close range. The probability that any specific individual in a state where bears are newly appearing will be seriously injured by a bear is low. But the probability is not zero, and the conditions that modify it upward, specifically habituated animals in a landscape without management infrastructure and a human population with no behavioral framework for bear coexistence, are being assembled across a broad swath of states simultaneously. The incidents that have occurred in the newly colonized states have shared a character that is consistent with this analysis. They have not been predatory attacks by wild conditioned animals. They have been close encounters driven by food conditioning, surprise, or the presence of cubs in areas where the human population did not expect bears to be and therefore did not behave in ways that either prevented the encounter or responded to it effectively. A homeowner who opens a back door at night and finds a bear at their garbage can is not prepared to respond in the calm, assertive, non-panicked way that the encounter calls for, because they have been told, implicitly or explicitly, that bears are not in their county. Their surprise drives their response toward panic and flight. The flight response in a surprised bear produces a defensive charge in a meaningful proportion of cases. The defensive charge produces injury. The injury produces a newspaper story. The newspaper story is the first moment at which many residents of that county learn that bears are present. That sequence is not theoretical. It is documented in incident records across multiple states in the last 6 years. The monitoring gap that precedes these incidents is as consequential as the management gap that follows them. Wildlife agencies in states with no established bear management programs typically do not conduct systematic bear monitoring. They do not have standardized protocols for verifying and recording bear reports in a way that allows trend analysis. They do not have DNA collection programs that would allow them to estimate population size or track individual animals across the landscape. They do not have the hair snare or camera trap grid infrastructure that established bear states use to generate the population estimates that inform management decisions. What they have is a passive reporting system that captures only the incidents that produce formal human-wildlife officer contact, which is a small and non-random fraction of the actual encounters that are occurring. The reports that do reach wildlife officers are often not centrally compiled in a way that allows geographic or temporal trend analysis. The result is that the agencies responsible for managing wildlife in these states are working with a fraction of the information that would be needed to characterize the bear presence accurately, making decisions about whether and how to respond based on data that systematically underrepresents both the number of animals present and the rate at which that number is growing. The trail camera revolution in American hunting culture has produced an accidental monitoring system that is in some ways more sensitive to bear presence than anything the wildlife agencies have deployed. The tens of millions of trail cameras that American hunters have placed in woodlots, creek bottoms, field edges, and forest clearings across the country are detecting animals that professional monitoring would take years to find. The bears appearing in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Louisiana are being documented first on hunters' trail cameras, not on any government monitoring device. The information is flowing through social media, hunting forums, and local news, rather than through official reporting channels. The photographs are real, the animals are real, and the geographic and temporal distribution of the sightings is telling a story that systematic analysis would make legible, but that remains fragmented and difficult to interpret in its current form because no one is aggregating it systematically. Several citizen science platforms have attempted to fill this gap, with varying success. iNaturalist, for example, carries verified bear observation records from counties well outside any officially mapped range in several states. Those records are available to anyone who chooses to look at them. What they show, in aggregate, is a range expansion that is further along, faster, and more spatially complex than any official range map currently reflects. The academic literature on bear recolonization is more candid than official agency communications about the pace and extent of what is happening, in the way that academic literature typically is. Studies published in journals including the Journal of Wildlife Management, Ursus, and Biological Conservation over the past decade have documented connectivity between previously isolated bear populations, range expansion across state lines, and the beginning of breeding activity in states where recolonization was considered decades away. A 2021 study using genetic analysis of black bear populations in the Central Appalachian region found evidence of gene flow between populations in West Virginia, and Kentucky that had previously been considered isolated, suggesting that landscape connectivity in that region was sufficient to support not just individual dispersal, but breeding-level genetic exchange. A 2022 study using harvested bear skull data from Arkansas to reconstruct population growth trajectories found that the Arkansas population, the primary source population for bear recolonization of the Mid-South, had been growing at a rate that made significant range expansion mathematically inevitable within the 2-decade window following the study period. The conclusions were stated carefully, in the hedged language of peer-reviewed science, but their implication was clear. The maps were wrong. The bears were ahead of the science, and the science was ahead of the management. The climate dimension of this story is not the simplest or most intuitive element, but it is real, and it deserves to be stated plainly. Climate change is altering the food production dynamics of the landscapes that black bears depend on in ways that influence both population growth rates and dispersal behavior. Mast production, the acorn and nut crops that represent the critical fall hyperphagia food source for bears across most of their eastern range, is becoming more spatially and temporally variable as temperature and precipitation patterns shift. In years of good mast production, bears can accumulate the fat reserves they need for denning without ranging widely. In years of poor mast production, they move. They move farther, in larger numbers, and in more directions than they would in a good mast year. The landscape they encounter when they move is a landscape that has been recovering secondary forest on a substantial scale for 3 decades, providing cover and food resources that make long-distance movement more sustainable than it would have been in the more fragmented landscape of the 1980s. The combination of more bears, more variable mast production, and better landscape connectivity produces a dispersal rate that exceeds the projections of models built on the ecological conditions of 20 years ago. The states that are currently classified as bear-free or near bear-free that are going to be most significantly affected by this process in the next decade are not difficult to identify. Missouri's Ozark region has been receiving bears from Arkansas for years, and the breeding evidence in the southern counties is substantial. The Mississippi and Louisiana bottomland systems are receiving bears from Arkansas's river corridor populations, and the habitat quality in those drainages is sufficient to support a permanent population at densities that would be biologically significant. Iowa is receiving bears from Wisconsin and Minnesota through the forested corridors of its northeastern counties. Kansas is receiving bears from the Missouri Ozarks along river drainages that provide both cover and food in an otherwise agricultural landscape. These are not speculative future scenarios. These are current field realities that are moving through the pipeline from informal observation to verified report to official acknowledgement on timelines that reflect the institutional factors discussed earlier rather than the biological pace of the recolonization. The management framework that would most effectively address this situation does not require the invention of new approaches. It requires the application of what established bear states have learned over decades to the new recolonization front states, on a timeline that runs ahead of the bears rather than behind them. That means proactive public education about bear coexistence, delivered in the counties where bears are being verified before those counties have produced their first injury incident. It means the establishment of verified sighting reporting systems that can capture and centrally analyze the information that field observers, hunters, and homeowners already have. It means the creation of livestock compensation program infrastructure that can be activated when the bear presence crosses the threshold of management relevance, without requiring the kind of political crisis that typically precedes new program creation. It means engagement with the hunting community as a monitoring and management partner, rather than a constituency to be managed after the fact. And it means honest public communication about the pace and extent of what is happening, rather than the defensive posture of official classification systems that can no longer be sustained by the field evidence, but that have not yet been formally revised. The honest public communication point is the one that generates the most institutional resistance, and the one that most directly shapes the public's ability to respond appropriately. When wildlife agencies in states with newly appearing bears frame each confirmed sighting as an isolated incident involving a transient individual, they are providing information that is technically defensible at the level of the individual sighting, but that is misleading at the level of the trend. The pattern of those sightings tells a story that the framing of each individual sighting deliberately obscures. People who understand that bears are establishing a regular presence in their county can take straightforward steps to reduce the probability of food conditioning incidents. They can secure their garbage, they can bring in their bird seed, they can be attentive in outdoor environments in ways that produce better encounter outcomes. People who have been told, implicitly or explicitly, that the bear their neighbor photographed last week was an aberration that has moved on, take none of those steps. The informational difference between those two framings has direct consequences for the probability of the kinds of incidents that end badly for both people and bears. The bear that killed a resident of any state officially classified as bear-free would produce a crisis at every level simultaneously. A public safety crisis, an institutional crisis for the agency that had not updated its official classification, a political crisis for the officials responsible for the agency, and a conservation crisis if the backlash produced the kind of unregulated killing that preceded the depletions of the 20th century. That combination of crises has not yet materialized. The probability that it will at some point is not negligible, and it is increasing as the number of states where bears are present without official acknowledgement grows, and the total time that bears have been present without management infrastructure increases. The incident that would produce it does not require a predatory attack by a wild conditioned animal. It requires a habituated bear in a food conditioning situation in a county with no public education infrastructure producing a defensive response to a surprised homeowner who was never told that the defensive response was something they needed to be prepared for. The story of the American black bear in the 21st century is, in its most optimistic framing, a recovery story. A species that was reduced to refuge populations in specific strongholds by the middle of the last century is expanding its range across a landscape that has recovered enough forested habitat to support it, through a combination of population growth, landscape connectivity, and the behavioral flexibility that makes bears uniquely capable of persisting in human-adjacent terrain. That is a genuine conservation achievement, built on the policies and the science of the past half-century, and it deserves to be understood as such. The expansion is not a crisis. The bears are not an invading army. They are an animal, returning to landscapes it occupied for millions of years, before the past 2 centuries of human alteration pushed it out, moving through restored connectivity in a recovering landscape, doing what successful large omnivores do when conditions improve. But the most optimistic framing is not the complete framing. The complete framing includes the institutional gap, the management vacuum, the public communication failures, and the food conditioning cascades that are occurring right now in counties across the central and southern United States, where bears are present and the human population is unprepared for them. It includes the livestock producers bearing uncompensated losses in states that officially have no bears and therefore have no obligation to compensate them. It includes the wildlife officers receiving trail camera photographs that their agency's official position cannot accommodate, and navigating the gap between what they are seeing and what they are authorized to say. It includes the homeowners who will not secure their garbage because they have no reason to believe that their unsecured garbage represents a genuine problem for the bear that will find it. And it includes, at the end of the chain, the habituated bear that the wildlife officer will eventually be called to remove. The bear that was not a problem until it was, because the infrastructure that might have intercepted the habituation process before it reached that point was never built because the bears were never officially there. The woman in Homer who watched an animal move through the grass across the drainage canal and reported it to a wildlife officer did something exactly right. She described what she saw accurately, she reported it to the correct authority, and she asked the question that the observation raised. The officer who received her report and drove to the site and photographed the prints and sent the photographs to Baton Rouge also did something exactly right. He treated the observation seriously, gathered the evidence, and sent it through the proper channel. What happened next is where the story becomes instructive. The confirmation came back. The prints were bare. And the officer returned to his normal duties in a state that, on the day he received that confirmation, officially had no wild bear population, with no updated guidance for the residents of that drainage area, no public communication about what the prints represented, no change in official classification, and no management response beyond a note in a file that a single observer had reported a single event that was consistent with the presence of a black bear in a state that did not, officially, have any. The bear, for its part, was not waiting for the administrative process to catch up with its presence. It was moving through the tall grass along the canal, through the drainage corridors between subdivisions, through the agricultural margins of a landscape that had been recovering from a century of depletion in ways that made it, once again, navigable. It was doing what bears have always done in landscapes where the conditions allow it. It was being a bear. The question was not whether it would continue. It would continue. The question was whether the humans in its path would be prepared for what that meant before the first incident that made the question unavoidable. In Louisiana, as in Indiana, as in Ohio, as in Missouri, as in a growing list of states where the official record and the field reality have diverged in ways that the institutional machinery has not yet resolved, the answer to that question is, as of the moment this is being described, no. That is not a permanent answer. It does not have to be. The monitoring infrastructure can be built. The public education can be delivered. The compensation programs can be designed before they are needed, rather than in response to the political crisis of an uncompensated loss. The official classifications can be updated on a timeline driven by the field evidence, rather than by the institutional convenience of not updating them. The hunting community can be integrated as the monitoring and management partner that its scale and distribution make it uniquely capable of being. The academic literature can be translated into management guidance on a timeline that matches the pace of the expansion rather than the pace of the peer review and publication cycle. All of these things are achievable. None of them are being done at the scale or with the urgency that the field evidence justifies. The bears are in the landscape. The question of whether the humans who share it with them will be ready for that reality is the only part of this story that is still genuinely open.